Hey guys, in today's video we are going to kick off our sew along for the Culotte jumpsuit pattern. So I am going to walk you through sewing the 3/4 length culotte version. You can pick any of the three variations, the full pants, the romper, or the culottes. All the legs will sew pretty much the same way, they're just different lengths. And the culotte is a little bit wider leg, but it still sews up the same way. So for this first section, we are going to look at sewing the bodice, and this will address the princess seams and the sweetheart neckline, which both use different types of curves and then different types of treatment needed for those seam allowances. All right, let's jump in and get started. To begin, let's take a quick look at the pattern pieces. So these smaller pieces here are the same for all three variations. We have the front, side, back, center back, and the pockets. And then the strap and waistband measurements are noted on the leg for view A and C. So you want to make sure that you cut those out as well. And those pieces are used for all variations. And you need a full set of lining pieces for the bodice. So for the center front, side back, and center back, you want to cut two full sets of pieces so that you have the exterior finished fabric and the lining fabric, as well as the waistband. You can do self-lined and just cut 4 of all of those pieces except for the bodice because it is laying flat. You'll just cut 2, but the others you'll cut 4, and then you'll cut 2 waistbands, and you can create that. You can do your lining out of a contrast fabric for just a unique and interesting look, or you can do self-lined fabric. Now for the legs, for this one we are going to do the culotte variation, so that is cut out right here, and then it has its own back piece that I've cut out as well. And then quickly, if you happen to be making the romper or the pants variation, the romper is cut from the same front piece, but you just cut right along this line right here so that you have a shorts length for the romper. And then the romper has its own back piece. And then for the pants variation, the pattern pieces are printed out as 2. And then here you can see we have these 2 green lines and arrows, and you simply overlap those so that it lines up exactly just like that, and then you'll tape that together, and then you'll cut out this whole entire leg piece. And then the pant variation has its own front leg that you cut out on its own, so you wouldn't use either of these pieces if you're doing the pants variation. Now let's talk about fabric a little bit. For this illustration, I'm just using 2 woven quilting cottons. We're going to cut the main body of the culotte jumpsuit out of this floral, and then the lining of the bodice and the waistband out of this yellow. So be very clear as I go through the steps, you'll be able to tell which part is which part of the pattern. And this fabric here also has a very distinct wrong side, so you can tell when I'm lining up wrong side, right side, all of that. Here we have all the pieces pinned on 1/3 of a yard of quilting cotton. So this is just folded in half, and I do have a small notch taken out up here at the top from something else, but it all fits on here. I have it stacked pretty tightly so that up here at the top I can use my rotary cutter and my ruler and simply just cut a long 1-inch strip, and then from that strip I can cut my waistband at 11 3/4 inches, and then my straps 5 inches long for each strap. So that leaves me enough room at the top, and I can just cut out all my pieces as is. And I just want to be really careful to make sure that I mark my areas that are important, like my pleat lines all slit into these seam allowance lines, and then being really careful to cut my princess seam line very consistently and trim down this seam allowance here, and you'll see why that's important as we work on our princess seam. And then any other type of notations, notching out right here for where you're going to sew up the center back, but you're going to want to stop here, so you might want to clip a little notch right here as you cut this pattern piece out. And here's a quick look at all the pieces for this project cut out. So you can see my lining pieces cut in yellow. I have a complete set for the bodice, the waistband, and then I have a complete set for the whole pattern cut out of the fashion fabric. So I have the bodice and a waistband, and then the straps in the pocket and the legs are cut out of fashion fabric only. To start, we have the bodice pieces in front of us, and you can see the fabric pieces cut right here, and then these are the pattern pieces. And I have these sitting here just so you can see this stitching line on both of the pattern pieces and how that compares to the pieces when they're cut out. So they're sitting side by side right here, and at first glance this will look like this seam is not going to line up because this seam allowance is actually longer than the interior cut line of this seam allowance. But if you come back 1/4 of an inch and you go into this one 1/4 of an inch, the actual stitching line on both of these pieces is the same and would line up if they were stacked on top of each other. So if you place those on top of each other, you can see that this stitching line would come and line up, and it's a little bit different shape, so it's hard to put it exactly on top, but the stitching line lines up. So the first thing that you want to do is in your shorter seam allowance, you're going to want to cut slits into that seam allowance. So I like to just fold my piece in half, and I have both of my seam allowance lines stacked on top of each other, and I'll just take my scissors and cut very short little slits just like that. They're about 1/8 of an inch into that 1/4 of an inch seam allowance, and right in this curve is where you're probably going to need most of them, because that's where you're going to need that to actually stretch in the opposite direction. So now I've done both sides at one time, and now I have a seam line that is going to spread apart nicely. So the other part that I'll note is the way this pattern piece is cut out. So we have a point right here at the stitching line. So you'll know when you're lining up with the side piece, if you were to start, you'd want to make sure that that point right there is where you would start your stitching. So if you were doing it backwards and you could see this first, you can see that your stitching is going to need to end here. So that's how those two pieces would overlap. Now I find that it's easiest to start by lining them up at the base or the straight edge corner down at the base of these two pieces. So you can see that these clearly curve in opposite directions. So I'm going to start by pinning this one at the base. And I'm actually going to run it through my machine starting at the bottom. So that enables me to carefully line these up and then pull this apart to match the curve as I'm sewing. So I can pin this in a few places, but honestly it is easier, I think, to do it just holding it as you sew. But you can see as I curve all the way around here, this will end up curving into that and matching that notched edge. Now we're at the machine and I have this threaded with a bright pink thread. I'm going to place this base point right here to sew this with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And then again, I'm just going to spread this open so that it curves around my other pattern piece here, the side piece that has the curve, and then this piece up here has the slits into the seam allowance. I'm going to put my needle in the down position so that I can pivot my curve as I sew. So you just want to be careful. The bodice is going to fold as you're pushing it out of the way. But if you keep that seam allowance flat, it can fold under the exterior side of the foot. You just don't want to catch any folds in your stitching. And then you can see right up here I do have this lined up, and this right here is where my stitching is going to come out. So now you can see that seam, and we have a little bit of spreading of that seam allowance as it's pulled open for the curve. But when I open it up, it lays flat and it's even from the base all the way up, and you can see that now has a nice curve to go under the underarm as well. And then on the inside, we're going to come in and press this seam open. And we can notch a little bit into this side because it is going to be a little bit lumpy as it curves back onto itself. Now we bring that back down and we're going to now sew this other side bodice piece onto the front bodice. And again, you can see right here we have a nice clean princess seam, and we've gone ahead and notched this seam allowance and pressed this seam allowance open. Now with this pattern, you can choose to top stitch along both sides of this seam line from the front just for some added extra detail. We thought that looked really nice on the chambray version because it's a denim look, and the top stitching really accentuates or highlights the seam lines in the bodice. But we didn't do it for all variations, so that's just an optional step at this point. Now for this opposite side, because if I was to push this through this way, it's a little bit harder to stretch this if it needs to be the underneath piece of the two pieces as I'm sewing. I can't really control the folding on the bodice side. So for this side, we're going to go in the opposite direction, and I'm going to start this like this, which seems pretty far off, but it lines up by matching the corner and matching a 1/4 inch into that where that seam would be with this little point right here. And that right there is where I'm going to take my first stitch, and then I'm just going to fold this open from the underarm down to the waistline as I sew. So again, I have the bodice center piece side up, the right sides together, and I've matched this right here at the very corner, and I'm going to start my stitching line right at this point. Now I'm just going to carefully spread my seam allowance for my princess seam here. Alright, so there we have the front bodice sewn with princess seams on both sides. So then we would also take our lining fabric with the center front and the two side front pieces, and then we'll repeat the same process with this princess seam line. But to continue with the fashion fabric, I have the center back bodice and the side back bodice pieces, and we are going to do the same thing. Now on this one, I have it notched slightly from when I cut it out. I actually cut a tiny little notch into the seam allowance on this princess seam line because it's pretty easy to actually get these mixed up and accidentally sew them with the center back seam connected to this princess seam line by mistake. So I've cut a tiny little notch just to make sure that I have my pieces lined up properly. And you'll see here as well that when you stack these next to each other, it does look like this seam line is too long for this seam line, but it's because the stitching line is a 1/4 inch in on both sides, and we have the same type of idea as the front bodice, except that this curve is not quite as severe as the one on the front. So we're going to go ahead on this shorter side and cut a few more slits into this. You don't need as many because the curve is not as big, or you don't need as much spreading. So I'm just going to put these on top of each other, lining up my seam allowance line, and I'll just cut a few little slits just above and below this notch that I already have. The base of this is probably fine. Now then for this one, I would do the same thing, and I will line these up right sides together, and you can see how the curve is slightly off this seam line. So I'm going to take this and I'm going to run this through the machine with the center back piece up so that I can pull that seam allowance open as I sew it. So when we sew the other side back, we're going to start up at the top, and we have this a little bit off center, and you can see that extending a little bit, but a 1/4 inch in is where that lines up. All right, now that we have gone ahead and sewn the princess seams on the front and the back, we are actually going to go in and sew these side seams to finish the fashion fabric bodice. Now we've already gone ahead and done that on the bodice lining, so you can see through this fabric actually pretty easily. So you can see the princess seams on the front, side seam, and then the princess seam that runs down the back of the bodice, and then this here would be center back. So at this point in the pattern, we have two things that we are going to do. The first is to simply take your waistband piece with right sides together, and you're just going to connect this seam. So that's pretty straightforward. We will just lay this on top, pin that, and straight stitch that down on both the lining and the bodice. Now the other thing that I wanted to show you is a technique that I really like to do, very narrow straps. So we have these two strap pieces, and you can simply press both of these sides in and then press it in half like that, and top stitch along both sides to create a strap. But then you have fold lines exposed. It's a little bit hard to get that even, and it's a little bit hard to top stitch. So another technique that I like to do is to create a tube and turn it right side out using a bobby pin. And this is really easy to do once you get the hang of how to thread the bobby pin into the fabric. It's pretty easy and goes pretty quick. So to start, we simply take the strap, and for this pattern, for this example, I could have actually just left this as one long piece so that I could do it all at one time and then cut it in half. But since I already have the pattern pieces cut out, I'm going to do it twice. So we have our two 5-inch pieces, and they're cut 1 inch wide, and I'm simply just going to fold these in half with right sides together, and then 1/4 inch in, I'm going to stitch a seam line straight down this strap. So here you can see we've gone ahead and stitched that stitching line. Then I'm going to come in and I'm going to trim down my seam allowance really close so that I have as little bulk as possible once I turn this right side out. Now I'm going to take my strap and I'm going to cut a slit into this folded end. And we have this piece cut longer than it needs to be, so you have room to play around at the end here. So a little bit in, we're just going to cut an angled slit right here. And you can see right here we have a little opening now on the folded side. And then I'm going to simply take the bobby pin and put it in this first part, but it's going to slide in, and then the top part of the bobby pin goes in that second slit. So you can see that right there. I'll do that again. Just threading it at the beginning is the important part. So you have your top side of your bobby pin, bottom side, that goes in there. This one goes on top and then into that slit. So what's going to happen here is this little section right here is going to get caught in this loop like that, and it will pull it inside this strap. And so if you're just gently using the tips of your fingernails, you just kind of pull that, and once it's sometimes a little bit hard to get started, but once you can get it to pull and start turning to the inside, it will then go much faster. So then my bobby pin is coming out the other end, and now I can feel that sliding along the fabric, and it is folding along itself. So you can see that it's coming out here, and then it begins to just turn all the way, and it magically just pulls all the way out. And then you can just take the bobby pin out. And now let's see, I'm rolling this to find the seam, which is right here. So this is my interior seam, and I can press this, but then I have a very narrow spaghetti strap, and I don't have to top stitch this if I don't need to. It is sewn shut. I can top stitch it if I want to for a decorative effect, and it is still a little bit easier than top stitching that folded one because there's a lot less bulk. Okay, now we have the bodice and the waistband all sewn and attached. So we're left with the final step of putting these straps basted down inside, and then we will put the lining on top and work on this sweetheart neckline. So we're going to want to do two things. First is this princess seam line right here is where the placement of the strap goes, and I want to put my strap with the right side of the strap facing down. So here I have that interior seam line, which is really hard to see on this because it's a print, but it is face up and it's been pressed so that it's in the center of the seam. So I am going to line up my strap with my princess seam, and if you see me doing this on the inside, it's a little bit clearer, but that's going to be centered right on there. And then if I was going to have top stitching, the top stitching, once this is flipped, would come down both sides of the strap, and that's why it would also come down both sides of that princess seam line. So I'm just going to pin that down, and then we will just baste that in place. Then we'll go ahead and do the same thing for the other strap. And then the other thing that I'm going to want to do is pay attention to this dot marking on the pattern piece, which is the stitch line for the sweetheart neckline, and where that corner will turn right at the center. So it's important on the actual fabric as you're stitching to know where it is you're going to want to pivot and have that curve go back up. So I'm going to be stitching from the wrong side of my fabric, and this is a 1/4 inch down from the center. So I'm just going to take a marking tool, and I have this right here. This is my center point right there, and I want that to be a 1/4 of an inch down, which is right at that 1/4 inch marking. So I'm going to mark that, and I'm drawing a V right there where my stitching line would be. And you can see that it's in this yellow pencil. I can see it a lot clearer in person. You could do this with a pen, you could do it with a pencil. A blue marking tool is pretty common. Just so that you know when you get right down to here how to pivot that stitch line so that you have a very even curve at the center of that sweetheart neckline. Okay, so I have these basted, and now I'm just going to take this lining piece, right sides together, and I'm going to match these up. So the first parts that I want to match up carefully will be my princess seam line and this center front marking. So I will be pinning that. Lining up my princess seam, and you can see on the back here, so we have that lined up. That right here is that little marking. I'm going to stitch from this side up, so I'm just going to continue to line up all of those seam lines. So my side seam, and then this back princess seam and center back. So first I'll start by lining up center back. And then in this pattern, we have directions to leave a small opening right on both sides of this princess seam in the back. And then we're going to insert the strap after we sew this seam, and then it will be finished off by the top stitching. But that way you can have a perfect fit for the doll that you're making it for. The dolls can vary in their body stuffing, even over the shoulders. So this way it's a lot easier to sew the bodice flat because the strap doesn't have to be curved underneath both sides, and you can get a perfect fit for the doll that you're looking for. And once you determine what works for the dolls you have, you can always write that down, and then you can have that for future reference. You don't have to measure on the doll every time. So I'm just going to make markings on here so that I don't forget that I want to leave this open. So I'm just marking that for when it goes through the machine, and then I'll do the same thing on this other side. I have the side seam, center back seam, and then we're going to mark this right here to just leave this open. And then for this example, we will finish the back and this back corner on part 2 of our tutorial. So we're just gonna work on this top line, sweetheart neckline in this next step. All right, so I have the fabric. I'm doing it fashion fabric side up. It's right sides together. I'm gonna pull this pin out at center back. And I'm going to sew this up to my first marking before the first princess seam line. So I've just sewn a back stitch. I'm going to pull this out, clip the threads, and then I'm just going to slide it forward on the other side of that princess seam. So a back stitch, and then I'm just going to continue all the way around to the other side. And I'm going to keep my needle in the down position so that I can pivot all these corners and curves. So first one we get to is the side seam. So I'm going to come all the way down, and when I hit that side seam stitching line, I'm going to pivot back up towards the bodice line on this sweetheart neckline. And I just want to make sure that I'm keeping this curve very smooth right along my 1/4 inch stitch marking line. And I have a little bit of bulk right here because my strap is there, and I just want to make sure that it's not twisted. I'm going to make sure that my seam allowance stays pressed open. And I'm curving right around. And now this is where I'm going to need to pay attention to this marking that I've done with my pencil. So I pivot, and I'm watching to make sure that I'm lined up so that I keep going all the way down. And then I lift up my foot, and I can look underneath here and I can see, and I'm right on the point. So then I'm going to spin it so that as I put my presser foot back down, I'm going to be lined up again with this seam allowance coming back up the other side. And then I'm just going to gently pivot. And then here we're getting close to this back princess seam line again. So I'm just going to stitch up to it, back stitch, and then slide past the princess seam line, back stitch, and then come all the way straight out to center back. So from the side, you can probably see these gaps a little bit better, but we've left the gap right here. So we've stopped and we've stopped, and we have a hole right here inside that space, and that's where we're going to slip this strap down just like this. Once we have it right side out, it will feed right into there, and we can catch it with the top stitching. Now the most important part with your curved seam, as we've kind of seen in some other videos, has to do with clipping this seam allowance. So we did a little bit of that on these princess seams where we've kind of create some slits or some notches to make sure that those lay flat and don't pucker. But when you have something like a princess seam line with the point coming down at center front, you're going to want to clip very, very carefully right up to the stitching line without cutting through the stitching. So if you have some really sharp little scissors, and you can come right up into there and you can cut a few snips and then see if you can get even closer. The closest you can get to that, the better this curve and this point is going to look when it's turned right side out. And then you can come in and you can trim away your seam allowances, so that right down at this point when it's turned right side out, you have as little bulk as possible, and that will help that to lay really nicely. So we have excess strap sticking out right here. This is a little bit bulky. I would try to trim out as much of that as you can. And then along all of these curved lines, you're just going to carefully come in and cut into that seam allowance with some notches, because this is going to fold into itself as it turns right side out. The seam allowance is going to overlap itself. So again, you want to do this as careful as you can without cutting in to that stitching line. So you can do it whichever method is easier for you. You can trim down your seam allowance first and then come back and cut little notches, or you can cut your notches first and then trim down. And if you happen to be stitching and you snip into your stitching line like I just did right there, this is a great example of, you can still save this. So pull that out carefully. I'm going to take this back over to the machine and I'm going to start a little bit back. I'm just going to go right over this stitching line before this fabric frays at all at this point. Okay, so you can see right there, I've gone ahead and just reinforced that because I accidentally cut into that. So now that's okay, and I can go back. I can trim off all the threads and I can continue just trimming out my seam allowance. And then right here, I'm just going to leave this seam allowance. I'm not going to trim it down right now because I want to be able to make sure that I turn that right side out all the way. Okay, so now we have cut and trimmed into this, and then we're simply going to turn this right side out. And you can use the strap itself and kind of pull on it a little bit to get this curve to turn all the way. You can use a tool like a point turner even when you're doing curves, and you can just come right in between your fabric and just really use it just to push the whole seam as smooth as you can. You can kind of just run right along the seam, and that will help it to look like a nice smooth curve. So we can work on that with our fingers. You can kind of roll the seam with the turning tool. So you can see we have a nice finished sweetheart neckline, and the straps come out from in between the fashion fabric and the lining very cleanly right on this princess seam line. So we're just going to take this over to the ironing board and just press this to have a nice even shape, and then we will work to continue the rest of the pattern in part 2.